Hello, I'm Craig Constantine.
Hi, I'm Tania Marien.
I like to torture people by not explaining that I hope they say hello back when I say hello. Tania Marien is the creator of a project called Terra, and she's an independent environmental educator. And it depends on what context you ask her to introduce herself, whether she says she's an educator or a podcast host or a creator of a project that involves environmental education. And I think that's a struggle that everybody suffers. I mean, or maybe suffers the wrong word. Maybe that's something we're all delighted to have that problem. Um, so today, I think we want to talk about, I'm not sure whether to call it synchronicity, asynchronicity, or how those two things affect community building. But that was something that came up in the conversation that we had before we press record on these things. And I'm wondering if you could tell me what are you trying to accomplish with community right now? Like, the podcast is not the main thing or the main thrust of what you're trying to accomplish. So what made you try to create a community? What are you trying to accomplish there?
Well, with the community, I am trying to encourage conversation among independent professionals in the field. Not everyone identifies as an environmental educator, yet there are many people out there who, through their work, connect people with the outdoors. And so I am trying to connect them and have conversation, to generate conversation between all of them. And so my audience, who I try to speak with, they aren't the traditional environmental educators, as you might think. Because as I've done my own independent work, I've come across a lot of different people doing different things, who have an environmental education focus, but they don't identify with that label. They might be a photographer, they might be a weaver, they might be a textile artist, they might be other things. And so by creating community for them, I would like for them, ideally, for them to communicate with each other, establish new possible partnership relationships, and so that's what I set out to do. I created the podcast to bring attention to the people who work in this capacity, to give them a voice so that people then can hear their voice, and so that I could have conversations with them that I've always wanted to have with them when I was running around doing events with what I used to do. Yeah.
So that sounds to me like you put a lot of thought into that. And I don't mean like before saying it, I mean before starting on that. So which part did you think would be harder? Did you think, well, the podcast is going to be really hard, or the community building be really hard? Or did you think, oh, if I do the podcast first, then the community building would be easier? Like, how has your idea of this is what I want to build, the whole grand vision, how has that been different or the same when you tried to actually do it?
Yes, it's been different.
I suspected, right?
So I chose to do the podcast because I was a heavy blogger before, and used to interview people then as well, have monthly featured guests and this, that, and the other, and offer Q&A opportunities through the blog. And so making things live and more interactive with the podcast, that is what I set out to do. So I thought that if the podcast came first and people started hearing the voices of colleagues and other people who were like them, then building the community would be easier. It
should be easier than doing it from scratch, right?
Yeah, and easier than just reading their words of colleagues through a blog, through a written Q&A interview. So that hasn't turned out quite to be the case. It hasn't been quite that easy to do. I started out with a co-working space, and then I switched to a different kind of community. I have, of course, a summit event that I had earlier this summer, which was very encouraging. I know of 4 collaborations to come out of that, and so that is very encouraging. And so that's not, that is encouraging. And so, but the community part, in terms of the everyday, weekly space for people, to be in and learn from. It's the farthest thing from forward link that you can imagine.
Mm.
They're there, but they're
They're
not
there.
talking to each other. They sometimes will reach out to me for chit chat, but otherwise.
So my question is, if you suspect that they're there, so I was going to say I have a dog in the fight, right? I love building communities, and so I'm packing my opinion into a question here. I'm wondering if you suspect that they're there, how important is it that you see all of those people being active in the community versus, okay, I know there are, some number, there's 50 people, there's 500 people here, and the system is occasionally emailing them. And when I want to reach that person, I know that I have this way to do it. So it's like, how valuable is an inactive community, even if you felt like you wanted to create an active community?
That's a good question. How valuable is an inactive community?
I mean, I'm not sure inactive is the right,
Yeah,
yeah,
no, I
like
know what you're saying.
yeah,
Yeah.
we built this classroom. We wanted to hold a circle space here in the center, but everybody's standing around the edge. And it's like,
Mhm.
well, I mean, if four people have a circle discussion, this is still useful. And I'm not saying you've created an awesome thing or you haven't created an awesome. I'm just saying, how do we figure out what is successful for, and community isn't quite the right word, this assemblage of people using some technology? How do we define success? How do we measure success?
Mm-hmm. Yes. And we'll call it I was going to continue with inactive community.
Inactive
An
community.
inactive community, it's valuable in that you can see who self-identify with your community. You can have some
Mm,
indication of enrollment, okay, because they chose to be there. Yet what confuses me is that they choose not to interact.
mm.
And I don't know how to make people talk. And I don't want to be making people talk, but I don't know how many
Right, right.
opportunities to provide to encourage conversation. The co-working space, my original co-working space, I was like busy all the time and had weekly, methodical, thought out, 3 months in advance type things to
Mhm.
and sent out. Um, yeah, and so I thought, well, maybe I'm being too heavy-handed, and so I started this. Closed that one, and then I started a second space, and yeah, encouraged conversation in different ways, but still, but then tried to back off to see what
Right.
people might do on their own, initiate on their own, and that also wasn't working for me.
Spun down.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, so there's a couple of things woven together here. There's the synchronous versus asynchronous aspect. There's the people's choice to step forward and engage, to speak up, versus being a passive consumer of what's happening in the community. Those are two, in my opinion, different things, right? And it's tough to tease that apart because you can't. You sort of, 100 people showed up for my synchronous workspace, and I decide, oh wait, asynchronous is better. Like the chances of those same 100 people like making the switch is like, see, like start all over every time. So it's super tough to run the experiments. And I think that the I was going to say social media, but I don't want to get them like I'm checking under my desk. My soapbox is not underneath me yet. Social media, I wind up, oh, hey, where'd this come from? Social media has trained us, but I don't mean that they necessarily did it to us maliciously. I just mean we have all gotten used to not interacting. So there is all the content that you could want if you just want to consume. There's nothing wrong with being a consumer. We all consume groceries, right? You need to consume things. But it's super easy to go to Instagram or Facebook, or recently I've been having conversations with LinkedIn has now turned into Facebook in terms of the quality of the content that we're seeing in our streams. So you can go and you can consume asynchronously, and you've gotten used to that. So if any of us, Tania or myself or other people, if we build a community and then hope for people that they're going to engage with it, it's like, oh, well, if it's online, and I'm air quoting online, then it's the same kind of thing that they've learned. Now, you and I know, yeah, but y'all could use this space differently and could make it a different thing. It could be like the old school bulletin board systems. Not that old school is necessarily better, but there used to be these super engaged communities who would get online, and it's like just people would post like crazy, and there's tons of interaction. So some of this, I think, is the difference between synchronous versus asynchronous. And the difference between whether people choose to engage or not kind of got buried underneath our habits. And I'm not sure how that's even our responsibility, but I'm not sure how you get people to change that. And I'm almost thinking the way to change that is to do something that's very different, to say, all right, we're having an interactive, I don't want to say webinar because that's got a broadcast connotation, but we're going to have this interactive thing in the podcaster community. I'm trying to do a thing called a workbench, which is where it's like somebody who has a question or something they want to work on, you pick a time, Craig promises he'll show up, and we're just going to all get together and talk about the thing. And it's ephemeral. Like you can watch the video afterwards, but, and that idea feels very different than any social media because, it's like it expires. It's got a window that you need to show up for. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on how do we go about figuring out what's the right medium to build in because the community is the thing that happens on or around or inside of. Like I built a lodge and a community sprung up. I didn't build the community. I just built the space, and then somehow that satisfied a need. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on, like, how do we build spaces, figuratively build spaces that fill a need that, like, yeah, we did the hard work of making something happen, and then everybody else engages with it. And is it, do the opposite day where we're like, okay, don't make it be like social media. Okay, make it be synchronous, or are there other places we can look?
Yeah. Yep. Okay, so here's what I'm trying now. This is my opposite day approach right now.
That was a Seinfeld reference,
Yeah.
right? Remember George Costanza an opposite day?
Yeah.
If everything I do is wrong, maybe I should just do the opposite, right?
Okay, so I have closed these communities, and real conversation is one of Talaterra's values. And I know real conversation works because that was very much built into the summit that I hosted in June. And that worked. And that part worked, that aspect of it, because there was the people who were present did engage with each other. There wasn't Zoom silence. I mean, and there are people talking to each other. And then, as I've mentioned, 4 collaborations have come out of that one instance, that experience. And so now that I've closed the asynchronous spaces, I am doubling down on real conversation. And so I'm hosting conversations about the purpose of environmental education. And it's centered around research and an activity conducted by Knology, which is a think tank on the East Coast. And it's about finding out, reflecting on what you think is the purpose of environmental education and what the people around you, the people you work with, think. And so they've created this really fun card sorting activity. And so what I've tried before with this particular activity is to invite people for an hour to do it in advance and then come talk about what they've found out. What I'm doing now is set up 90-minute co-working sessions where people can work on it together. Nobody needs to find time to go do this in advance. And so it's I hope it is a more comprehensive type experience. And so it touches on having live face-to-face conversation, and also supportive in this co-working type environment. And that is my current opposite day activity. I mean, that is my move away from asynchronous communication. And what I've also done is, what I'm also doing is offering an opportunity for people to create their own work groups so that they don't have to walk into a situation where they don't know anybody else. If they already know about colleagues or community partners who they want to have this conversation with, my invitation to them is contact me, claim one of the available sessions, and it's all yours.
It's all yours.
Yeah.
My train of thought went to how much of the success that you're seeing comes from modeling the outward behavior. So, there's no reason why anybody else, like, they could make a work group, right? Like, it's so easy to do these things, but it doesn't happen. But for some reason, when you do it, when you like put the thing in, then people are like, oh yes, I can do that too. It's like, oh, like we all know that modeling, this is how we do it, then other people do it as well. And I'm wondering, is that like an inherent human, I don't want to call it a flaw, is that an inherent human thing that we're not so great at? So things go well when somebody shows us how to do it? Or is that something that we've learned, more recently about, we've all forgotten how to, like, I see lots of articles online about how to make friends. And I'm like, what do you mean, how do you make friends? It's easy. Like, find something you want to do. You want to go hiking? Go hiking. And then when you run into somebody on the trail, say hi. And if you see them again, introduce yourself. And I'm wondering, is it inherently human, do you think? Or is it the type of people who are into environmental education? We can pigeonhole them all as being more introverted. I don't think that's real. I don't think that's an actual judgment. So, like, why do you think, I'm air quoting again, simply modeling it suddenly seems to make it, you're like, well, why didn't this work, asynchronously? If I put up a post that says you should get together and work in working groups, nothing happened. But when I make a working group and do it, then it happens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm going to say it's a little of both. My reason for doing this is to establish seamless connections, to make it easy. Like I said, by carving out a block of time for this type of thing that nobody else needs. My thinking is nobody else needs to carve it out. So that part makes it easy. And if they know people who they want to have this conversation with, they know who to invite. That is easy. I would think would be easy. But there is some truth to what you said about those in the field being a little more introverted. There is some truth to that. Yeah, there's some truth to that, because what you sometimes find is there's tension. What I've seen, heard, and observed, there's tension between the reasons why some have entered into the field, not necessarily maybe the education part, but the natural resources part, I'm going to say. They like this type of work because it's kind of separate from the crowd. And then they get put in a position where they're frontline interpreter, and then they have to be more outward. And so I'm citing that example as that being some truth to what you just said. And I don't know when it comes to, and sometimes I think the word co-working is not the right word. I mean, it makes sense to me, but it's not a common word. And so I don't know if that concept is part of my problem with getting people together.
It is. Yeah, there's always the challenge of, like, speaking is so slow, right? Compared to the train of thought that you can have. So at some point you have to, and I'm not currently referring to my inability to ask a question. I'm referring to, I'm going to build a community and I want to set up this thing. And you have all these ideas and you're like, okay, I need a word for this. I need a noun so I can write a sentence to describe it to somebody else. And you never really know for sure that the idea that you had in your head made it across to the other person. And maybe they have a completely different idea of what you're thinking. Like, oh, the last one of those I tried was terrible. So, suddenly it's dead in the water before they even gave it a try, or they might've had a great experience with that. So that's one of the big difficulties I see with anything that I do in communities, let alone building communities. There's always this challenge of, like, how does what I say actually affect the other person?
Mhm.
I've started going to great lengths. I like to send people like random messages, just like, "Hey, thinking about you today, and I saw this cool thing, and I wanted to share it with you." And I've started actually adding a second message, which explains why. Like to say, "I thought of you when I saw this," because I'm like, some people know that I can really be snarky, and they might think that that's a sarcastic dig at their inability to keep their house clean, or whatever the example is. And I'm
Yeah.
like, I thought this was funny because it reminds me of the time I fell on the stairs, and we all had a good laugh. And I just think what you're doing by like repeatedly trying to share and then model the behavior, that seems to me like that's the way to do it. You're like, "Hey guys, I want to try this because," and then I think it worked. And like, but saying all that, making that all be overt, I think that's really the only way to be sure that your ideas are landing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep. And that's a good point. To be more observable, more to be more
Intentional.
vocal, yeah, intentional, and to live it, and to live it out loud. Because I know I can really pull back, depending, and be an introvert.
Yeah. Well, I do. That's like, that's gonna be a defense mechanism. Like,
Yeah,
okay, here we go.
yeah,
Time out, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. But I know that also one of my, I guess I would call it a strength, is to be a cheerleader, to bring attention to other people's work. Because
Mm,
with what I used to do, I used to interview a lot of people, and I would reach out to them and say, "Hey, can I interview you for the blog?" And they're surprised. And they're surprised that someone noticed one, and then they don't think they need to have anything to say.
yeah.
And then, but my reaction is, well, yeah, don't you know what you're doing? This is what it looks like to me. And this is what I see. So let's talk about it. And so, anyway, I don't know. This is an ongoing experiment.
But
On,
I think
yeah.
your point there is that's really good about you know the unpacked version of "I see you." That's a
Mm-hmm.
super useful thing because not only is that super useful to the person that you said it to, but you're also modeling behavior. It's like the whole pay it forward. If everybody went around and said "That's awesome" to more people when they saw awesome things, people would be like, "Oh, I'm going to build more awesome stuff if you
Yeah.
think that's awesome." So
Yeah.
I think that's also like there's a meta level there. And then there's a meta level, which is that's exactly what I'm trying to do here with these conversations is just sit down with people who are in any way related to podcasting and talk about these things that I think all of us are thinking about. But it's tough when you're in your own silo, your own day-to-day mind of like, well, I don't know. So here's two people talking about synchronicity versus asynchronicity versus, I think I'm calling this one community, but
Okay.
unless you want a different word.
Nope.
Cool. All right, Tanya. Well, it was a delight as always. You and I've had many conversations, but delight as always to talk. And thank you for letting me pick your brain.
Oh, well, thank you, Craig. Thank you so much. I love this series that you're doing.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
it's very good.
Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.
Thank you. You too.